The wind howled through the empty road as darkness swallowed the small town of Maple Ridge. Grandma Louise, a 68-year-old widow with soft eyes and silver hair tied in a bun, was wiping down the counter of her tiny roadside diner. The clock on the wall ticked past 9 p.m., and the rain outside began to fall in heavy sheets, drumming against the windows. She sighed softly, glancing at the open sign flickering weakly in the storm. It had been a slow night, just a few travelers stopping by for coffee and pie, but Louise didn't mind. Her diner had been her life since her husband, Henry, passed away years ago. It wasn't much, but it gave her comfort, something to keep her heart busy. As thunder rumbled in the distance, she started to turn the sign too closed. Just then, the growl of engines rose from down the road, deep and powerful, echoing through the rain. She paused, squinting through the window as 9 motorcycles emerged from the curtain of storm. Their headlights cut through the darkness like ghostly eyes, and for a moment, the sight made her heart skip. 9 large leather-clad men on roaring bikes pulled into the gravel lot, their tires splashing water everywhere. The glowing patch on their jackets caught her eye. Hell's Angels. Louise's hand froze on the door handle. She had heard stories about biker gangs, rough men who rode hard and lived harder. Alone in her diner, miles away from the nearest town, fear began to whisper in her mind. The thunder cracked loudly above, as if to remind her of the danger outside. But then, she noticed their condition drenched from head to toe, shivering, exhausted. One of them tried to shield his eyes from the rain as he looked toward her door. For a long second, it was only the storm between them. Louise took a deep breath, her heart steadying. She thought of Henry, who used to say, "You can't judge a soul by its cover. Lou, the world already does too much of that." And with that memory warming her courage, she unlocked the door, opened it wide, and called out, "Come on in, babies. Storm's no place for anyone." The men hesitated, glancing at one another. Rainwater streamed down their faces, and the wind tugged at their jackets. One tall man stepped forward, his expression cautious, but respectful. "You sure, ma'am?" he asked, his voice deep but uncertain. Louise nodded, her eyes kind but firm. "Get in here before the lightning takes a liking to you." Slowly, they filed in, dripping onto her black and white checkered floor, their heavy boots echoing in the small space. The smell of rain and leather filled the room, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee and apple pie. For a moment, silence hung in the air. The bikers looked around, unsure what to do, while Louise moved calmly behind the counter, grabbing towels from a drawer. She handed them out without a word, her gentle smile disarming the tension that clung to the room. One of the men, with tattoos peeking from under his sleeves, murmured a quiet thank you. It was said awkwardly, as if he wasn't used to saying it. Louise nodded, then turned on the coffee pot. The comforting hiss and drip of brewing coffee filled the quiet space. The rain outside grew louder, but inside the diner, something began to soften. The men took seats at the booths and counter, exchanging small, uncertain smiles as warmth slowly returned to their faces. Louise noticed one of them eyeing the dessert display, and she chuckled. "That pie ain't gonna eat itself. Sugar." "You boys hungry?" she asked. A few laughed quietly, shaking their heads in disbelief at her easy tone. "We don't want to trouble you, ma'am," said another. Louise waved her hand dismissively. "Trouble's when you track mud in my kitchen. You're just wet." Her words made them smile, and before long, the sound of spoons against mugs and rain on the roof created a rhythm of comfort. The thunder still rolled, but it no longer felt threatening. Louise watched them eat, remembering how Henry used to say her food could calm a storm better than prayer. She didn't know who these men were, or what stories followed them. But she could tell one thing: they hadn't been shown much kindness lately. As lightning flashed across the window, she caught sight of their faces softening in the glow, faces that had seen hard roads, perhaps too many. One of them leaned back and said quietly, "Ain't every day someone opens their door for us." Louise smiled gently, her eyes tired but warm. Maybe the world would be kinder if more folks did. Outside, the rain began to ease, the thunder fading into distant rumbles. The men sat quietly, sipping their last drops of coffee, while Louise wiped the counter once more, humming an old hymn under her breath. None of them knew it then, but this simple act, an open door on a stormy night, was about to change everything that came after. Steam rose from the coffee pot as Grandma Louise poured the dark, fragrant liquid into 9 mismatched mugs, the clinking of glass echoing softly in her little diner. The storm outside was still roaring, but inside, the glow of yellow light made the place feel like a pocket of safety. The bikers, still dripping from the rain, sat awkwardly at the booths, their heavy jackets squeaking against the leather seats. They had told her they were part of the Hells Angels, their voices carrying both pride and hesitation, as if waiting for her to flinch at the name. But Louise hadn't even blinked. "Well, baby, you can call yourselves what you like," she said with a smile, setting the steaming mugs in front of them. "Just don't let that coffee get cold." Her easy tone caught them off guard. People usually stared, whispered, or found reasons to walk away when they saw their jackets. But this old woman, this tiny silver-haired lady, was treating them like long-lost family. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered biker with a gray beard, muttered, "You ain't scared of us." Louise looked at him with her calm brown eyes and said, "Honey, I've lived through worse than rain and leather. You're just people, same as me." The man didn't know how to respond. He looked down into his coffee, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled. Louise disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a pan of golden cornbread, still warm from being reheated in the oven. The smell filled the diner, mixing with the scent of fresh coffee and rain-soaked clothes. "Ain't fancy," she said, cutting it into thick squares, "but it'll keep you warm." The men accepted the food quietly at first, glancing at each other as if unsure whether to trust her kindness. Then one of them took a bite, and his eyes lit up. "Ma'am, this is the best thing I've eaten in years," he said with a grin. The others laughed, their voices deep but genuine. Slowly, the tension began to melt away, like ice under sunlight. Louise chuckled softly. "That's just butter and heart, sugar," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. The thunder rolled again, but it no longer felt frightening. The diner, with its flickering neon light and smell of baked bread, had become a Havana small island of warmth in the storm. As the night went on, the sound of conversation began to replace the growl of thunder. The bikers started sharing stories from the road about the long highways, the sunsets they'd chased, and the strangers who crossed the street when they walked by. Louise listened quietly, her eyes full of understanding. "People see our jackets and think they know who we are," said Rick, one of the younger men with sharp eyes and a kind voice. "They don't see the miles or the hearts behind the leather, just the name." Louise poured him another cup of coffee and leaned on the counter. "Honey," she said softly, "good hearts don't need clean vests to shine." Her words hung in the air for a moment, and the room went silent. Rick looked at her with a surprised smile, like someone who had just been seen for the first time. "You're something else, ma'am," he said quietly. Louise chuckled. "I've been called worse." Laughter spread through the diner like light spilling into a dark room. One of the bikers tried to fix the flickering bulb near the counter, while another helped Louise carry empty plates back to the sink. The sight of 9 rough men working together in a tiny kitchen would have made anyone smile. They joked about her coffee being strong enough to wake the dead, and she teased them right back, saying their loud engines couldn't scare off a sleepy cat. Outside, the rain began to ease, but none of them seemed eager to leave. It was as if time had slowed down, and for that one night, they were all just people sharing food, warmth, and stories. Louise noticed the way they looked around her diner like it was more than a stop, like it was home. As midnight neared, the laughter faded into comfortable quiet. The storm was finally moving on. But the bond that had formed between the old woman and the bikers felt stronger than any thunder outside. The men leaned back in their seats, content, their eyes soft with gratitude. Louise looked at them and thought how strange life could be, how sometimes kindness found its way through the unlikeliest doors. When she finally turned off the coffee pot and dimmed the lights, she glanced at the group one last time. "You boys get some rest before you ride again," she said. Rick nodded. "We will, ma'am. And thank you for treating us like people." Louise gave a small smile. "That's all any of us are, darling." And as the rain whispered against the windows and the clock ticked past midnight, her little diner stood like a glowing lantern in the night, a quiet reminder that even in the roughest storms, warmth still finds a way. When the first light of dawn crept through the gray clouds, the rain finally stopped, leaving the world outside Grandma Louise's diner washed clean and glistening. The air smelled of wet earth and coffee, and a thin mist curled around the road like a secret. Inside, the bikers stirred from their seats, stretching their arms and rubbing their tired eyes. The storm that had trapped them all night had passed, but something gentle still lingered in the air, a calm born from the strange bond that had formed over cornbread and laughter. Grandma Louise, her hair tucked neatly under her scarf, moved quietly behind the counter, humming a soft tune as she refilled their cups one last time. "You boys sleep at all?" she asked, with a teasing grin. "Not much, ma'am," Rick replied, his voice rough from the night. "But this is the best rest we've had in weeks." The others nodded in agreement, their usual hard looks softened. They had arrived the night before as strangers, but now they looked at Louise with the quiet respect of men who had been seen for who they truly were. As they finished their coffee, one of them reached for his wallet. "Ma'am, we owe you for the food, the warmth, and the roof," he said sincerely, pulling out a few bills. Louise shook her head firmly, her kind eyes steady. "No, baby. You needed a roof, not a receipt. That's payment enough." The men looked at her in silence, unsure how to respond. People rarely refused money, especially not for 9 full-grown men who had eaten their fill. But Louise wasn't most people. She had spent a lifetime believing that kindness was meant to be given freely, not traded. Rick stood up, slipping his gloves back on, and said, "You didn't have to do what you did, ma'am. Most folks would have shut their doors." Louise smiled faintly as she wiped down the counter. "Well, most folks need to remember, we're all out in the same storm, just in different boots." Her words made them laugh quietly, but there was a depth in her voice that stayed with them. The men walked outside, where their bikes were glistening under the morning sun, droplets of water clinging to the chrome. The air was still cool, the road damp but inviting. Before they climbed on their bikes, Rick turned back toward her and said, "We'll see you again, Grandma. That's a promise." She chuckled lightly, waving her hand as if brushing off the thought. "I'll be here, same place as always. Y'all ride safe now." The engines rumbled to life, filling the air with their deep growl. Louise stood by the window and watched as the 9 bikes rode off one by one, their red taillights glowing against the morning mist until they disappeared down the road. For a moment, she stood there in the quiet, the diner suddenly feeling much bigger and emptier. When the sound of engines faded completely, she sighed softly, turning back to her tables. She picked up empty mugs, stacked plates, and wiped the counters until every surface shone. The smell of coffee drifted through the room again as she brewed a fresh pot, just like she did every morning. To her, last night had been special, but she didn't expect anything more to come of it. In her heart, kindness was a gift you gave and forgot about. That was her way of life. She had seen too much to expect something in return. As the morning light grew stronger, Louise opened the blinds, letting sunshine flood the little diner. Outside, birds began to chirp again, and the world felt peaceful, like the storm had been just a bad dream. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, and smiled at the quiet road stretching endlessly in both directions. "Another day," she murmured, half to herself. The hours passed gently. A few travelers stopped by for breakfast, truckers ordered coffee to go, and a local farmer dropped in for pie. Everything felt normal against the way Louise liked it. She had no idea that something unexpected was on its way. Something that would turn her quiet life into a story no one in Maple Ridge would ever forget. That night, as she closed up and turned off the lights, a strange thought crossed her mind. For the first time in years, the diner didn't feel lonely. Maybe it was the memory of laughter still echoing in the corners, or maybe it was the warmth of knowing she had touched a few hearts on a stormy night. Either way, she smiled before locking the door and heading upstairs to her little apartment above the diner. She didn't know it yet, but the peace she felt that evening was just the calm before a very different kind of storm, one that would arrive not with thunder, but with the thunder of 100 roaring engines. The next day dawned bright and peaceful, the storm now only a memory carried away by the wind. Grandma Louise opened her diner as usual, humming softly as she brewed coffee and flipped the sign to open. The sun shone on the wet road, making it sparkle like a river of glass. Everything seemed too calm. Around 11, the bell above the door jingled as a few regulars came in for lunch. Louise smiled, poured them coffee, and went about her usual rhythm, but just before noon, as she wiped down the counter, she felt something strange, a faint vibration under her feet, like the earth itself was waking up. At first, she thought it might be a passing truck, but the rumble grew louder, deeper, rolling through the air like distant thunder. The windows began to tremble, and the forks on the tables rattled softly. The customers looked up, startled. "What on earth is that?" one of them asked. Louise set down her rag and stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sun. And then she saw them. Down the long stretch of highway, a line of motorcycles appeared, more than she could count, at first shining chrome catching the light like waves. The roar of engines filled the quiet countryside, growing louder with every passing second, until the very ground seemed to pulse with their rhythm. Louise's heart skipped a beat as she realized what was happening. Leading the group were 9 familiar faces, the same men she had sheltered from the storm. Behind them stretched a sea of riders, at least 100 strong, their leather jackets gleaming, their presence both powerful and strangely peaceful. It was a sight that could make anyone's heart race, but Louise didn't move. She just stood on the steps of her little diner, apron tied around her waist, as the line of bikes rolled closer and closer, then slowed to a stop. The engines quieted one by one, leaving a thick silence hanging in the air. The smell of oil and dust mixed with the scent of her freshly brewed coffee. Louise's regular customers peered nervously through the windows, unsure whether to stay or run, but she didn't feel afraid, not after the night before. The 9 men from the storm stepped forward, their boots crunching on the gravel. Rick was in front, his usual grin replaced by something more serious, almost emotional. Louise looked at them, her eyes wide but steady. "Well," she said with a small smile, "if it isn't my boys back from the storm." Rick nodded, his voice soft. "Told you we'd see you again, ma'am." Before she could respond, one of the men reached into his jacket and pulled out a small weathered envelope. He handed it to her carefully, as if it were something fragile. Louise frowned, a little confused, and opened it. Inside was a short handwritten note that read, "For your kindness, we don't forget good hearts." Beneath the note was a thick stack of bills, crisp, folded neatly, and far more than she had ever seen at once. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The sunlight glinted off the paper in her trembling hands. "Oh no, honey," she said finally, her voice shaking. "I can't take this." Rick stepped closer, shaking his head. "You already did more than money could pay for, Grandma. This ain't payment, it's respect." His words were simple, but they hit her harder than thunder. Around them, the other bikers stood quietly, watching, their eyes filled with something rare, a mixture of pride and gratitude. The sound of engines idling in the distance filled the silence as Louise looked from the note to the crowd of men. The whole scene felt unreal, like something out of a dream she didn't know she had. The wind tugged at her apron, and for a moment, her diner, small, worn, and tucked away on a lonely highway, looked almost magical. The bikers had come not out of duty, but out of heart. They had ridden all this way, just to show that kindness had not gone unnoticed. She pressed the envelope to her chest, tears forming in her eyes. "You boys didn't have to do this," she whispered. Rick smiled softly. "Maybe not, but we wanted to." Louise blinked back her tears and took a shaky breath. "Well," she said, her voice trembling but steady, "I hope you're hungry, because I got fresh pie cooling in the back." Laughter rippled through the crowd, light and warm. The tension broke, and soon, the engines turned off completely as the bikers parked their motorcycles in neat rows. One by one, they entered her diner, filling the space with noise, life, and the scent of leather and road dust. The regulars who had once looked fearful now sat amazed as the place came alive with voices and laughter. As Louise moved between tables, serving food and pouring coffee, she couldn't stop smiling. Just yesterday, she had given shelter to 9 strangers. Now, 100 hearts had come back to repay her kindness, not with words, but with presence. The roar that had once frightened the ground now filled the air with gratitude. The diner, that had once been a quiet, lonely spot on the side of an empty road, was now filled with laughter, warmth, and the deep hum of conversation. That afternoon, after the 100 bikers parked their shining motorcycles in neat rows outside, Grandma Louise's little world changed forever. The air buzzed with energy as the men crowded into the small diner, filling every booth and stool. The once still and silent place that had heard only the ticking of a clock was now alive, with voices and laughter that rolled like music through the room. Louise moved quickly behind the counter, pouring cups of coffee, cutting slices of pie, and shaking her head every time someone tried to pay. "You boys already done enough," she said with a smile, but they ignored her, leaving generous tips on the tables anyway. The smell of fried chicken, baked bread, and fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of leather and gasoline. It was a strange combination, but somehow, it felt right. As the afternoon stretched on, stories began to flow as easily as the coffee. The bikers told tales from the road about near misses, long rides, and strangers who became friends. Louise listened with genuine interest, sometimes laughing so hard that tears formed in the corners of her eyes. For men who were often feared wherever they went, it felt strange and comforting to be treated like guests, like family even. One of them, a quiet man named Dale, looked around the diner and said softly, "Haven't felt this kind of peace in years." His words hung in the air, and everyone nodded. It was as if the little diner had become a safe haven not just from the storm outside, but from the storms life had given them. Louise wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Well, baby, peace ain't found. It's shared." Outside, townspeople began to gather, drawn by the sound of engines and laughter. At first, they came cautiously, peeking around corners, unsure of what to expect. Many had heard of the Hells Angels and their reputation, and the sight of so many bikes parked in front of the diner made them nervous. But what they saw when they looked through the windows changed everything. They saw the old woman serving food to the bikers, laughing with them, and the men, those same men with tattoos and leather jackets, helping her carry plates, fixing a broken chair, and sweeping the floor before leaving. The story spread quickly through Maple Ridge. People didn't talk about bikers or gangs. They talked about kindness, about how one woman's open heart had brought something extraordinary to their quiet town. Word traveled faster than gossip ever could, and for the first time, everyone spoke the same thing: kindness travels faster than fear. In the weeks that followed, The Hells Angels didn't forget Louise. They came back, just as they had promised. But they didn't come to cause a stir. They came to help. A few of them noticed the diner's roof leaking in one corner and offered to fix it. Others brought paint and brushes, giving the old walls a new life in bright cream and red. They even helped Louise put up a new sign above the door that read Louise's Diner, good food, good hearts. Every weekend, they would roll into town, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in dozens, always stopping for coffee, cornbread, and conversation. They never made a fuss, never asked for attention. They came because of her. The changes didn't stop there. With the money they had left her in that envelope, Louise hired a young local boy named Timmy, who had been struggling to find work. She taught him how to cook, how to greet customers, and how to keep the coffee hot and the heart open. Soon, the diner became a gathering place for everyone, locals, travelers, truckers, and, of course, the bikers. The walls, once dull and cracked, were now filled with pictures of the Hells Angels grinning beside Louise, the townsfolk joining them for meals, and even one of the entire group standing together under the diner's new sign. As the months passed, every Sunday morning brought the same familiar sound, the deep, distant rumble of engines rolling down the road. But this time, no one felt fear. The townspeople would wave from their porches, and kids would run to the diner to watch the bikers arrive. The men would walk in, tip their hats, and say, "Morning, Grandma," as if she truly were family. Louise, now known as Grandma Louise, to everyone, always greeted them the same way with a pot of coffee, warm cornbread, and that same loving smile. And though the world outside the diner still had its storms, inside, there was always light. Her kindness had done something no one expected, had changed hearts. The Hells Angels, once seen as outlaws, became symbols of gratitude and respect. The woman who had opened her doors during a thunderstorm had unknowingly opened something much greater. The understanding that one small act of compassion could ripple through countless lives. On quiet nights, when the last customer left and the lights dimmed, Louise would look at the photos on the wall, smile softly, and whisper, "See, Henry. Kindness still rides." And somewhere down the road, 100 engines would rumble like a heartbeat, carrying her lesson far beyond Maple Ridge.